It was a perfect summer afternoon, the sun hanging lazily in the sky, casting a golden hue over the sparkling water of the local pool. Families lounged in the sun, kids splashed around, and the soft murmur of conversation floated through the warm air. Amidst the chatter and laughter, Ava sat at the edge of the pool, her wheelchair positioned under the shade of a large umbrella. Despite her immobile legs, her face was full of life, eyes sparkling as she smiled and laughed with her mother, Samantha, who was seated beside her. Ava was an unlikely source of joy in a world that often overlooked her. With her bright laugh and infectious spirit, she carried a lightness that seemed to brighten any space she entered. She was different, yes, confined to a wheelchair, but to Samantha, she was everything. As Ava clapped her hands in excitement, her laughter rang through the air, bringing a smile to her mother's face. But not everyone shared their joy. Karen, a middle-aged woman with a furrowed brow and arms crossed tightly across her chest, sat on a lounge chair nearby. Her gaze was sharp, eyes scanning the pool area like a hawk watching for any sign of disturbance. Ava's laughter reached her ears, and her expression soured. "She's too loud," Karen muttered under her breath, glancing at the other poolgoers, who were either too busy or too polite to notice. She leaned towards another woman sitting beside her and whispered something inaudible, her voice tinged with irritation. The woman gave an uncomfortable nod, clearly unsure how to respond. Ava, however, was oblivious to the tension. She continued to laugh, unaware of the storm brewing just feet away from her. She felt a chill in the air, though, a faint discomfort that made her look up for just a moment, meeting Karen's steely glare. But before she could fully comprehend what was happening, Karen turned away, muttering something under her breath, her eyes narrowing as she watched them. Samantha, sensing the change in atmosphere, instinctively placed a hand on Ava's arm, but Ava brushed it off, unaware of how dangerously close to trouble they were. The pool had never felt so quiet, and the unease in the air lingered like the calm before a storm. The sun hung lower in the sky now, casting a long shadow over the pool. The water, once inviting, now seemed to shimmer ominously, reflecting the growing unease in the air. Ava, oblivious to the mounting tension, leaned back in her chair, her laughter still echoing through the space. Samantha sat beside her, gently brushing a lock of hair from Ava's face, her eyes scanning the pool. The heat was unbearable, but the presence of something darker was palpable. From across the pool, Karen stood up, her face twisted with something more than annoyance. She marched toward Samantha and Ava, her steps sharp and deliberate, cutting through the hum of the busy poolside. Ava, sensing something was off, stopped laughing. She looked up and saw Karen's determined march, her hands clenched at her sides. Samantha's heart sank. She had hoped that the tension would dissipate, but now, it was clear that Karen had made her way over for a reason. Ava watched as the woman approached, her eyes wide with uncertainty. Something about Karen's expression sent a chill crawling down her spine, even before she spoke. "Excuse me," Karen's voice rang out, cold and direct. "Why is she allowed to disrupt the peace here? It's supposed to be a calm environment for everyone, and your daughter's constant laughter is unnecessary." Samantha froze for a moment, the words hitting her like a slap. She opened her mouth to respond, to explain that Ava had as much right to be there as anyone, but Karen didn't give her a chance. "This isn't a place for distractions," Karen continued, her voice rising with each word. "Some of us come here to relax, not to be bombarded with this constant noise. She's disturbing the peace, and it's not fair." Ava, still in her wheelchair, shifted uncomfortably. Her gaze flickered between Samantha and Karen. She had never seen anyone speak like that to her mother. Why was this woman so angry? Her fingers twitched nervously at the edge of her chair, her heart racing. She wanted to speak up, to say something to make it stop, but she felt frozen, helpless. Samantha's protective instincts kicked in, and she stood up slowly, trying to maintain calm. "I'm sorry if she's bothering you," Samantha began, trying to keep her voice even, "but she's just a child." She's allowed to enjoy herself like everyone else. Karen's eyes narrowed, a strange, cold fire flashing behind them. I'm not asking for permission, she snapped, her voice a low growl. I can make this stop. Ava's breath caught in her throat. The word sent a wave of cold dread through her body. Samantha glanced at her daughter, her own face tightening with worry. Ava, sensing the shift in atmosphere, felt her heart pound in her chest. She wanted to ask what Karen meant, but the fear gripped her, her mind racing with possibilities. Samantha caught Ava's eye and shook her head subtly, urging her to stay calm. But Ava couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to spiral out of control. The once lively and cheerful atmosphere of the pool had shifted. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the very space around them was holding its breath. Ava's heart hammered in her chest, her body tense with a mix of confusion and fear. The playful splashing of the other kids and the hum of casual conversations now felt distant, like the world had narrowed down to just the three of them. Karen's face twisted into something unrecognizable, anger, frustration, and something darker. She was no longer the woman who had simply grumbled about noise. Now, she was a force, her entire body rigid with a cold, unsettling authority. Ava's stomach churned with unease, and her fingers clenched tightly at the armrests of her wheelchair, desperately trying to steady herself. Samantha stood protectively between Ava and Karen, her voice trembling but firm. Please, just leave us alone. You've made your point. There's no need to escalate this further. But Karen was no longer listening. Her eyes narrowed as she took another step forward, her lips curling into a sneer. You think I'm just going to let this go? No one disrupts my peace. Ava tried to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. Mom, what's happening? Samantha's eyes met hers, full of worry and confusion, but there was something else, a flicker of fear she couldn't hide. She bent down to Ava's level, trying to keep her calm. It's okay, sweetheart. Just stay calm. But it was already too late. Without warning, Karen's hand moved quickly to her side, and the unmistakable glint of a small, silver gun appeared from beneath her jacket. Ava's breath caught in her throat, her eyes widening in disbelief. The poolside that had once felt like a place of relaxation now seemed like a battlefield. A gasp rippled through the crowd. People stopped what they were doing, eyes widening in shock and confusion. No one knew what was happening, but everyone knew something was terribly wrong. Karen pointed the gun straight at Ava, her face hardening. She's disturbing my peace, she hissed. I told you to keep her quiet. Samantha froze. For a moment, she didn't know what to do, how to react. Her heart raced, her thoughts were jumbled, but the only thing that mattered was Ava. She stepped forward, her hands raised in a desperate attempt to shield her daughter. No. Please, don't do this. This is insane. But Karen's finger tightened on the trigger. I warned you. Ava's breath quickened, her chest tightening as the gun was aimed directly at her. She couldn't move, her wheelchair was stuck in the water, the wheels caught on the edge of the pool. She tried to push herself backward, but her legs remained useless, uncooperative. The water splashed around her, adding to the panic of the moment. Her hands trembled on the wheels, but she couldn't free herself. Samantha's voice rose in desperation, please. You don't have to do this. Her voice cracked as she looked back at Ava, trying to find a way to protect her. Ava's heart was racing, her mind spinning as she stared at Karen, who was standing there with the gun, her eyes cold and unwavering. This wasn't just about a noise complaint anymore. This was real. The pool had fallen into eerie silence, save for the rhythmic sound of Ava's anxious breathing. Time seemed to stretch, the tension suffocating, as everyone waited for something to happen, something they couldn't predict, couldn't even comprehend. Ava's vision blurred, her pulse racing in her ears. She wanted to scream, to shout for help, but she couldn't move, couldn't speak. All she could do was sit there, trapped in her chair, trapped in her fear. The poolside, once a place of laughter and light, now stood in eerie silence, the heavy tension suffocating the air. The shimmering water seemed to mock the stillness, its once inviting surface now dark and foreboding. Ava sat in her wheelchair, her body tense, eyes wide with terror as Karen's cold gaze remained fixed on her. Samantha stood in front of Ava, arms raised in a desperate attempt to shield her daughter, her heart pounding in her chest. Karen's finger tightened on the trigger. Her hand shook slightly, but her expression was one of determination, a belief that she was in control, that this was the only way to make it stop. "Stay calm, sweetheart," Samantha whispered, her voice shaking as she turned her head towards Ava. But Ava couldn't breathe, couldn't focus. Her world had narrowed down to the cold metal of the gun and the sharp, violent look in Karen's eyes. "Get back, now," Karen hissed, her voice shaking with a mix of fear and anger. Her eyes darted from Samantha to Ava, as though she was trying to convince herself of the justification for what she was about to do. Ava's heart pounded painfully in her chest. Her fingers trembled against the armrests of her wheelchair, struggling to push herself backward, but she was trapped. The water had wedged the wheels of her chair into a small groove in the ground. Her body was frozen, but her mind raced, every inch of her desperate for escape. And then, in one horrifying moment, the world erupted into chaos. The sound of the gunshot was deafening, a sharp crack that seemed to tear through the air. Ava's body jerked violently, and she felt an intense, searing pain explode in her leg. It wasn't just the sharpness of the pain, it was the shock, the sheer disbelief that this was happening. Her breath hitched in her throat as she cried out, her body jerking in pain. "No!" Samantha screamed, her voice raw and filled with the kind of terror that no mother should ever experience. She lunged forward, rushing to Ava's side, but the world seemed to slow around her. The crowd had erupted in panic. People scattered in every direction, their terrified voices rising in a cacophony of confusion and fear. But all Samantha could see was her daughter, her precious Ava, slumped forward in her chair, blood beginning to pool around her leg. Ava's breath came in ragged gasps. Her hand pressed against her leg, trying to staunch the bleeding, but it was futile. Her vision blurred, and the pain, sharp and relentless, consumed her entire body. But worse than the pain, worse than the injury, was the cold, terrifying fear that flooded her veins. What had just happened? How could someone do this to her? To them? Ava's gaze flickered upward, her tear-filled eyes locking with Samantha's. Her mother's face was contorted in anguish, her hands trembling as she tried to pull Ava from her wheelchair, but the effort was too much. Samantha's voice cracked as she pleaded, "Ava, please, stay with me. Please, don't leave me." Ava wanted to say something. She wanted to reassure her mother, to tell her that it was okay, but all she could do was silently beg for help with her wide eyes, pleading for someone, anyone, to stop this nightmare. Karen stood frozen, staring at the gun in her hand as if she couldn't quite process what she had just done. Her breath came in short bursts, her mind racing to justify her actions. This was just a lesson, wasn't it? A way to make them understand. She hadn't meant to hurt the girl, just to silence her. But the horror of the reality of what she had done began to sink in. Ava's blood was on her hands, and no matter how she tried to deny it, the weight of that truth was suffocating. Samantha's frantic movements became more desperate as she pressed her hands against Ava's wound, her tears falling freely, mingling with the blood on her daughter's leg. "Please. Please." Samantha's voice was a broken whisper as she pleaded for help, looking around desperately, but there was no one close enough. "Help her." Samantha screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice trembling with panic and sorrow. But as the sound of sirens grew louder, echoing in the distance, Karen stood still. A flicker of remorse, a hint of horror, passed through her, but it was too late. What had been done could not be undone. Ava was still breathing, but every second that passed felt like an eternity. The scene had descended into madness, but there was one thing clear: nothing could ever erase what had just happened. The sterile smell of antiseptic filled the hospital room, mingling with the soft beep of Ava's heart monitor. The room was dim, the only light coming from the faint glow of a lamp beside the bed, casting long shadows across the walls. Ava lay motionless, her body draped in the rough hospital sheets, her leg wrapped in bandages. Her face was pale, her skin clammy, but the worst of it was the pain, an unbearable ache that pulsed through her leg, making her head spin and her stomach churn. Samantha sat beside her, her hand gently clasping Ava's, but her grip was weak, trembling. She hadn't left her daughter's side since they rushed into the emergency room, her own heart shattered, every second stretching into an eternity. She had barely spoken since the surgery, too afraid, too devastated to find words that could provide any comfort. The hum of the hospital faded into the background as Samantha's eyes filled with tears once again. She wiped them away quickly, not wanting to show Ava how scared she truly was. She had to be strong for her daughter, even though inside, her world had crumbled. How could someone do this to her baby? Ava's eyelids fluttered, her groggy eyes slowly opening. The world around her seemed blurry and distant, but the pain in her leg was sharp, relentless. Her first instinct was to reach for it, but the bandages were too thick, and a cold pressure stopped her from moving. "Ava," Samantha whispered, her voice breaking as she leaned over her daughter, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "You're safe now. You're going to be okay. Just rest, honey. Everything will be okay." Ava blinked, her eyes struggling to focus, but her voice came out weak, confused. Why would she do this, Mom?" Her words were strained, heavy with a mixture of pain and disbelief. "What did I do to her?" Samantha's heart shattered all over again. She had no answer. She had no idea why anyone would do such a thing. Her thoughts swirled, but nothing made sense. She gently squeezed Ava's hand, her own voice trembling. "I don't know, baby. I don't know." Ava's breathing hitched, and she winced as a sharp pain lanced through her leg, making her body tense. "It hurts," she whispered, her voice small, vulnerable. "I know, sweetheart," Samantha replied softly, her eyes filling with tears again. "The doctor said it's going to take time, but you're strong. You'll get through this. We'll get through this, okay?" Ava nodded weakly, but her mind was still foggy, her thoughts clouded by the question that lingered: why? Why had Karen done this? What had she done to deserve such cruelty? Samantha wiped away another tear and brushed her daughter's cheek. She felt the weight of the world pressing down on her, and the crushing guilt of not being able to protect Ava from this madness. But her focus remained on Ava, on her daughter's recovery. Nothing else mattered now. As the minutes passed, Ava's breathing became more even, though the fear in her eyes still lingered. Samantha stayed by her side, silently praying, her hands never leaving Ava's. Her daughter was alive, but that didn't feel like enough. There was still so much to overcome. A soft knock at the door interrupted the silence. A nurse stepped in, her face calm, but there was something in her eyes that made Samantha's stomach drop. She hadn't been expecting visitors. She hoped it was good news. "The surgery went well," the nurse said, her voice gentle. "But we need to keep an eye on her for a while. I'll check in on her every few hours." Samantha nodded, grateful for the nurse's care, but her nerves were already on edge. She barely had a chance to breathe when the nurse added, "I just wanted to let you know that Karen, the woman who shot your daughter, she's still not been arrested. We don't know where she is right now." The words hit Samantha like a physical blow. The air seemed to leave the room, and for a brief moment, everything stood still. Ava hadn't even been able to process the violence that had been thrust upon her, and now, there was a threat hanging over them, a threat that still lingered, unaddressed. Samantha's hand tightened on Ava's, her heart racing with the sudden realization that this nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun. "Thank you," Samantha said, her voice barely above a whisper. The nurse nodded and left, closing the door behind her, but the words kept spinning in Samantha's mind. Karen was still out there. Ava was alive. But was she truly safe? The question gnawed at her, and for the first time, she felt the weight of something much larger than the physical injury her daughter had suffered. This was about more than just healing. This was about survival. And it wasn't just Ava's life that had been shattered. It was their entire world. The courtroom was suffocating, filled with the weight of everyone's stares, the sharp silence hanging heavy in the air. It was as if the room itself had stopped breathing, waiting for something to happen. The walls, cold and sterile, seemed to close in on Ava as she sat on the witness stand, her hands tightly clasped in her lap. The wooden bench where Karen sat across from her, face impassive, felt like an impossible distance, yet Ava could feel the woman's gaze piercing through her, colder than anything she had ever known. Samantha stood just behind her, her posture stiff, but her eyes filled with nothing but concern for her daughter. She had always tried to shield Ava from the cruelty of the world, but now, it was as if she were the one who needed protection. The weight of this moment, this fight for justice, was more than she could bear. But she couldn't show weakness, not now. Not when Ava needed her strength the most. Karen sat across from them, her lawyer beside her, trying to look calm and collected. The tension between the two women felt like an unspoken battle. Karen's lawyer was making his case, claiming that the shooting had been an accident, that Karen hadn't meant to harm Ava, that the gun had gone off in a moment of panic. His words were sharp, like daggers aimed at Ava's broken heart, twisting the truth to fit the narrative Karen wanted to create. Karen, sitting with her arms folded, didn't even seem to care about the weight of the accusations. She didn't look remorseful. There was no apology in her eyes, only an eerie sense of entitlement. She had made a choice, and now, she was trying to make it seem like she was the victim. Samantha clenched her fists at her sides. She wanted to scream at the injustice of it all, but she knew she couldn't. She had to stay calm for Ava. She had to fight with every fiber of her being to make sure that Karen paid for what she had done. The judge, a stern woman with a sharp gaze, called the courtroom to attention. "We'll now hear from the victim." Her voice cut through the air, and for a brief moment, Ava felt a cold shiver run down her spine. Ava hesitated. She had been preparing herself for this moment, but now that it was here, words failed her. Her mouth felt dry, her throat tight. The fear of speaking out in front of so many people, the fear of being vulnerable in such a public space, almost overwhelmed her. She wanted to shrink into herself, to disappear. But then, she felt her mother's hand on her shoulder, a simple gesture, but one that brought her a semblance of strength. Ava turned slightly to look at Samantha, and for a moment, their eyes locked. Samantha's eyes were filled with so many emotions, love, fear, and a deep, unshakable belief in her daughter's strength. Ava took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of her mother's support. With trembling hands, she stood up and approached the stand, her heart pounding in her chest. She faced the courtroom, her voice barely above a whisper at first. "I didn't do anything wrong," she began, the words struggling to form on her lips. "I was just being me." The words felt hollow, but the more she spoke, the stronger she became. She remembered the warmth of the sun at the pool, the laughter she had shared with her mom, and the way Karen had ruined everything in an instant. She shot me. For no reason. I didn't deserve this." Her voice quivered, but there was a fierce edge to it now. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a survivor. Ava felt her nerves ease as the words began to flow more naturally, and she found herself looking directly at Karen. "You took something from me. You took my peace. You took my life." Her voice grew stronger, filled with the anger and sadness that had been building inside her since the moment she'd been shot. The courtroom fell silent as Ava's words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. For the first time, everyone seemed to understand. They saw her, not as a girl in a wheelchair, not as an object of pity, but as a person, with a voice, with a story to tell. Samantha watched her daughter with tears in her eyes. She had seen Ava face so many challenges, but this was different. This was a turning point. Ava had found her voice, and with it, she was showing the world what strength truly looked like. But the courtroom wasn't finished with its questioning. There were murmurs, whispers in the air, as some people still struggled to understand the full extent of what had happened. There were those who wondered if Ava had somehow deserved the treatment, whether she had done something to provoke Karen. Ava could feel their eyes on her, the weight of their judgment, but it no longer mattered. The judge remained silent, her face unreadable, as she took all the words in. Ava could feel the tension mounting, the quiet of the courtroom thickening like a storm about to break. And then, she heard it, Karen's lawyer, once again, trying to twist the truth, shifting the blame. Ava clenched her fists at her sides, but her mind was clear. This was not about Karen. This was about justice. The judge raised her hand to silence the room, her gavel poised, but Ava couldn't shake the feeling that the outcome was still uncertain. She watched Karen's face, no remorse, no apology, only a hardened, defiant expression that made Ava's blood boil. As the judge prepared to speak, Ava held her breath. Would justice be served? Or would Karen escape, free to hurt someone else? The courthouse parking lot was quiet, save for the distant hum of the city streets and the occasional rustling of leaves in the cooling evening air. The light from the street lamps cast long shadows, and the night had begun to settle in. Ava and Samantha stood by their car, the weight of the trial still hanging over them like a storm cloud, the outcome uncertain. They were exhausted, physically, emotionally, but there was a sense of relief, too. The trial was over, but they both knew it wasn't truly finished. Not yet. Samantha was still trying to process everything that had happened. Ava had testified, had spoken the truth, but Karen's lawyer had spun such a convincing story that it made Samantha's stomach twist. And as much as she wanted to shield Ava from all of it, she knew this fight wasn't just about legal justice. It was about Ava's emotional recovery, and that was something that couldn't be won in a courtroom. The sound of heels clicking against the pavement interrupted her thoughts. Samantha's eyes flicked up just in time to see Karen walking toward them, her head held high, an almost smug look on her face. Her attorney was nowhere in sight, and the air between them felt thick with animosity. Karen's smile was tight, almost mocking, as she approached them, her eyes lingering on Samantha first, then sliding over to Ava. "You know," Karen began, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "I'm surprised. After everything, I thought the jury would have some common sense." She stepped closer, her gaze lingering on Ava. "But it seems they'll fall for anything, don't they? Maybe it's just the way things work in this city." Samantha's jaw clenched, her protective instincts flaring up again. She stepped forward, but before she could say anything, Ava's voice cut through the tension. "Stop," Ava said firmly, her voice more confident than it had ever been before. Samantha froze, her heart skipping a beat. She hadn't expected Ava to speak up, not like this. Ava's eyes locked on Karen's, no longer filled with fear, but with a fierce determination that made Karen take a hesitant step back. Ava took a slow breath, her hands clenched at her sides as she stared Karen down. "You don't get to do this anymore," Ava continued, her voice calm but powerful. "You don't get to control me. You don't get to make me feel small, and you sure as hell don't get to take anything from me." Samantha's eyes widened in surprise. She had seen her daughter grow in the past few months, but this was different. Ava was no longer the victim. She was standing up, confronting her abuser face to face for the first time, and she was doing it on her own terms. Karen's expression faltered, the smirk slipping from her face for just a moment. She had expected to intimidate them, to remind them of her temporary victory in court, but Ava wasn't backing down. Karen opened her mouth to speak, but Ava held up her hand, silencing her. "You're not sorry, Karen," Ava said, the words sharp and filled with an edge that seemed to make the air crackle. "You don't even understand what you've done. But I don't need your apology. I don't need your pity. Samantha felt a lump form in her throat, a mixture of pride and worry. She wanted to step in, to shield Ava from the harshness of the confrontation, but something inside her told her to stay back, to let Ava take this final step toward reclaiming her life. Ava continued, her voice unwavering. I'm not the one who's broken here. You are. And no matter how much you try to make it seem like it was my fault, or that I deserved it, I'm not going to let you win. You lost the moment you decided to hurt me. Karen's face tightened, the anger barely contained behind her cold eyes. She took a step forward, but Ava didn't flinch. In fact, she stood even taller, her gaze unwavering. For the first time, Karen looked uncertain, unsure of herself, unsure of the woman standing before her. The woman who had been silenced for so long, but who now had a voice that was stronger than anything Karen could ever take from her. Samantha's heart raced as she watched Ava, her daughter, her hero, face the woman who had nearly destroyed their lives. But just as she thought Karen might respond, Ava's next words hung in the air, unexpected and final. I forgive you, Ava said, her voice steady and clear. The words dropped like a bomb, and for a moment, everything stood still. Karen's face registered shock, confusion, but Ava's gaze never wavered. Samantha looked at her daughter, her heart swelling with pride, and yet, a small part of her ached for the innocence that had been lost. Ava turned toward Samantha, giving her a small, almost imperceptible nod before looking back at Karen. But that doesn't mean I'll forget. And I won't let you hurt anyone else. As the silence stretched between them, the moment felt timeless. Ava's words hung in the air, carrying more weight than any verdict in the courtroom. The tension in Karen's face was replaced by something else, a flicker of doubt, perhaps fear. Ava had won. Not with revenge, but with strength. Without another word, Ava turned and walked away, Samantha following closely behind. As they walked toward their car, Ava's steps were sure, no longer burdened by the weight of the past. The outcome was still uncertain, but one thing was clear, Ava had finally found her power. The scene cut to black. The park was peaceful, an oasis of green amidst the bustling city, with soft breezes rustling the leaves in the trees. The sun had begun to set, casting a warm golden hue across the landscape, and the sound of children laughing in the distance seemed almost too idyllic, too serene for the storm Ava and Samantha had weathered. The world around them was a stark contrast to the turmoil they had endured, but somehow, it felt right, calm, healing, and full of potential. Ava wheeled herself slowly along the paved path, the movement smooth now, though her leg was still bandaged beneath her jeans. She winced occasionally, a dull ache that would follow her for weeks, maybe months, but it was nothing compared to the constant pain she had felt before. Her face, once haunted by fear and uncertainty, now held a quiet confidence, a subtle strength that radiated from within. Each day was still a challenge, but Ava was learning to face it head-on, one step at a time. Samantha walked beside her, close enough to reach out at any moment but giving Ava the space she needed to reclaim her life. Her heart swelled with pride as she watched her daughter move forward, unbroken by the horrors they had faced. She could feel the weight of the past few months pressing on her chest, but at this moment, in the golden light of the park, it felt manageable. The pain, the trauma, they were still there, but they weren't who they were anymore. They weren't going to define them. Ava looked up at her mother, her expression soft yet determined. You know, I never thought I'd feel this, normal again, she said, her voice thoughtful. I thought something like this would change me forever. Samantha smiled softly, her heart aching at the vulnerability in Ava's words. I don't think it's about going back to normal, honey. It's about finding a new kind of normal. A stronger one. You've shown me that. Ava's lips curved into a faint smile, but there was still a trace of sadness in her eyes, a reminder of the innocence she had lost. I'm not the same girl I was before all this, she said. But maybe that's not such a bad thing. No, it's not, Samantha agreed, her voice filled with a quiet pride. You've grown so much, Ava. You've become someone I can't help but admire. You're stronger than you'll ever know." They continued walking in silence, the sun sinking lower, casting long shadows on the path before them. It was the kind of peace they both desperately needed. Ava's thoughts drifted to Karen, the woman who had forever changed their lives. The anger that had once boiled inside her had faded, replaced by a quiet resolve. Karen was out there, still a threat, still someone who had shattered their lives with a single act of violence. But Ava had found a new kind of power, and it wasn't in revenge. It was in moving forward, in finding peace despite the chaos, in healing. As they reached the park's exit, Ava paused for a moment, glancing back at the playground where the children were still playing, their laughter echoing in the air. She felt the pang of loss, of her old life, her old self, but she also felt something new, something that wasn't there before. Hope. Samantha stopped beside her, noticing the change in Ava's demeanor. "You okay?" Ava nodded, her smile genuine, though it was tinged with the weight of everything they had been through. "Yeah. I think I'm finally okay." The two of them started walking away from the park, a step toward the future, one they would face together. But unbeknownst to them, Karen watched from a distance, standing just outside the gates. Her eyes narrowed as she observed the mother and daughter, still plotting her next move, a dark and twisted resolve taking root. As Ava and Samantha walked off into the fading light, the journey ahead seemed uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Ava felt like she could handle whatever came next. The world was wide open, and she was ready to meet it head-on. The sun had nearly disappeared below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Ava and Samantha walked side by side, their steps steady and purposeful. There was no rush to reach any particular place, no destination except forward, into the future, into the healing that awaited them. Ava's hand rested lightly on the wheels of her chair, her gaze focused ahead, but her mind was clear. She didn't know exactly what lay ahead, but for the first time in months, she felt ready to face it. Her body might still carry the scars of what had happened, but her spirit was unbroken. She had found a strength within herself she never knew she had, and it was that strength that would carry her through whatever challenges awaited. Beside her, Samantha walked with a quiet pride in her heart. She had been broken too, but watching Ava fight for her voice, for her life, had reminded her of what really mattered: family, love, and the unwavering support they had for each other. They had been through the worst, but they were still standing. As they walked, the camera panned out, catching the two of them in silhouette against the vibrant sky. But then, in the distance, there was Karen, standing at the edge of the park, watching them, her face twisted in regret. Her once unshakable confidence had crumbled. She was no longer in control. The final shot lingered on Karen's face, the weight of her actions sinking in as Ava and Samantha walked away, ready to embrace the life they would rebuild.